maybe if you feel comfortable with it, maybe we could start with you explaining a little bit about what you did that got you into prison to begin with.
Well, I guess it began when I was a kid growing up. I was the youngest of 6 children, 4 brothers and a sister, and we lived on the wrong side of the tracks. My sister started riding with the motorcycle gang when she was a teenager, and my brothers roamed the streets as juvenile delinquents. My father was a drunk. I can't say alcoholic because that would be a euphemism. And he was very rarely employed, and we lived in very cheap apartments, and he would duck the landlord as long as he could, and then we would creep out in the middle of the night and go to somewhere else. I can very clearly remember my mother holding her finger to her lips when the landlord was beating on the door, and I can feel her sense of shame, you know. She did not like being in that position. But anyway, by the time I was 8, 2 of my older brothers had already gone to reform school, and it was sort of expected of me to follow their lead, which I did when I was 12 years old. My first time to reform school was for truancy and arson. I was cutting school one day and set fire to an apartment building that was in the process of being demolished to make way for new development. And anyway, once I went to reform school the first time, I met like-minded, like-spirited kids, and I started running away, and we would escape from reform school and steal cars and break in grocery stores, and it just became sort of a way of life, you know. And to tell you the truth, I thoroughly enjoyed it at the time. It was exciting, you know. But as things progressed, you know, I can remember when I was a very good kid. I was an average American boy. When I was 7, I believe, I was taking my teacher an apple and I got hit by a car. And it split my head open, and everybody was concerned about how I was doing, and the only thing I wanted to know was, where's my apple? You know, I wanted my teacher to get that apple. But, you know, peer pressure is the worst culprit as far as influencing people to go into very deep and dark territory. And there's nothing that a parent can do or a child psychologist can do that overpowers peer pressure, unless that's made a focal point of the therapy. You know, kid has to understand what's happening to him when he agrees to smoke a joint or take a drink of wine, whiskey, or whatever, or jump into a stolen car for a joyride. But anyway, to get back on track, as an adult, I went to prison 3 times, and the last time, well, not the last time, next to the last time, a friend and I escaped. And while we were on escape, we escaped from the Kentucky State Penitentiary, went to Texas, and as a means of survival, we were robbing grocery stores, small-time robberies. And one night, things went crazy, and we wound up shooting a man and killing him. And that put me on death row in Texas. And I stayed on death row for 3 years, during which time I had sort of an epiphany. Death row will make a philosopher out of you, of sorts. You know, you start asking yourself questions like where you came from, why you're here, and especially where you're going, you know. But I dropped out of school in the 4th grade. I had no, whatever little education I had forgotten. But I wanted to read. I liked to read the books that I could read, and I wanted to read bigger and better books. So I built my vocabulary. I worked on it very intensely every day for 2.5 or 3 years. And I finally got to where I could read books like The Psychology of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden, which had a tremendous impact on me, because it's not just a rah-rah book about, love yourself and all that. He was very deep, very sophisticated, and he taught me about things like repressed memories and childhood traumas and how they're interrelated. And I had read a bunch of paperback psychology and studied hypnosis, and I was practicing yoga, doing meditations. So I developed this form of self-analytical meditation. And I would sit cross-legged and do my pranayama breathing exercises, and then regress myself back to my earliest childhood memories, one of which was my father pounding on my mother, and it's very strange how the subconscious will give you information that's important to you. Like I remember two memories I had of. One was when I was about 9, my mother and father were separated, and me and one of my brothers were staying with my mother, and a couple of my brothers were staying with my father, and a couple with aunts and uncles. But we had this bird we called Tweety, parakeet. And usually when we went somewhere for the weekend, or my mother would have someone to come in and feed the bird and water it and all that. But this particular holiday weekend, 4 or 5 day weekend that we were gone, she forgot to do that. And when we came home, Tweety was stiff as a board with his legs up in the air. And we all sat around the dining room table and just bawled our eyes out, over this little bird. But in 1970, when I was 23 years old, and right before my fall partner and I, my partner in crime, approached this man to rob him, I told my fall partner, whatever you do, don't fire that gun, because I had a previous fall partner who liked to walk in a convenience store and fire 2 or 3 rounds into the ceiling to get everybody's attention, which made me nervous as hell. Well, anyway, during the course of this robbery, things went crazy. The guy made a motion for his hip pocket, and my fall partner thought he was going for a gun. So he shot him, and I had a pistol trained on him. When I heard the shot, I shot him. But when he hit the ground, he was in a sitting position, and I had heard stories about people who were in a situation like that, and if they just turned around and walked away, the person was still alive and functional enough to pull out a pistol and shoot him in the back. So I frisked this guy, and he didn't have a pistol in his hip pocket. He was trying to give us the bank sack. He just wanted to cooperate and satisfy us and let us disappear, But what I wanted to get to is when we got back in the car, my fall partner said, "Man, I'm sorry I shot that guy, but I thought he was going for a gun." And pardon my French, I said, "Fuck it, I hope the bastard dies." Well, when I was doing my meditation years later, regressing back through the memories, I first remembered Tweety, and then I remembered the scenario of the robbery. And a voice in the back of my mind asked, what the hell happened? How could you go from a 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid to bawl your eyes out over a parakeet, but be so coarse and callous toward another human being? And that started a very profound, drawn-out process of me trying to get inside my head and figure out how the hell I wound up on death row. I've never thought of myself as being the sharpest tool in the shed, but I'm not the dullest one either. I've got a little sense. And it didn't add up that I would just keep going to reform school. Every time I got locked up, my heart would bleed for my mother, I would be homesick and distraught. And I suffered, Nobody likes to be locked up. So I kept asking myself, why would you do that to yourself, And finally, when all was said and done, it boiled down to a conflict between me and my father. My father, you know, I suffered from what the psychologists call ambivalence. I loved him. I loved him to death. He was my dad. He took me to movies and stuff, you know. But by the same token, he was a drunken, irresponsible, unaccountable piece of shit. You know, he would get paid on a Friday and disappear for 2 weeks and leave my mother high and dry trying to support 6 kids, you know. And he drove an old battered pickup truck worse than what Sanford and Son used to drive, you know. And he would take me to school, and I was ashamed to get out of the truck and go in the schoolhouse. I would go in the front door, through the school, out the back door, over the fence, and be gone. Next question.
So when you were going through that self-analysis and trying to figure out how you got from Tweety to the scene at the drugstore, I mean, and you're saying that it was just your role with your father.
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. When I'd already been to reform school a couple of times, and I guess I was about 15, and we moved into this house that he was leasing, and I took a BB gun, and on the second floor we had about 8 or 10 windows with storm glass windows in it, and I went up there and shot a hole in the right-hand lower corner of every window in the house. And I knew, I didn't think about it, I didn't realize it at the time I was doing it, but I had to know that I was setting myself up for a confrontation with my dad, you know. And sure enough, a few days later, I was out in the backyard throwing a pocket knife at a tree, and he walked up to me and he said, "Michael Wing, come here, I want to show you something." And I knew immediately what was coming down, you know. So we went in the house, and he took me upstairs, and we went to the first window, and he said, "You see that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Come here." And we went to the next one, all through the second floor, doing the same routine. And at the last one, he said, "What the hell's wrong with you? Are you fucking nuts or what? You know, why did you do that?" And I said, "I don't know." But at that time, I didn't. But after the experience on death row, the meditation and all that, if I had it to do over again, I would have told him, "Well, Dad, that's my way of kicking you in your ass, you know, for treating me and my siblings the way you have, the way you treated my mother, the way you disrespected us and embarrassed us. That was my way of saying, I don't like that part of you." And that's pretty much the whole story, you know. My old man, when I got caught shoplifting in a store, and they would call him and tell him, "Come down here, we need to talk to you, we busted your kid shoplifting," he would go down and he'd be humiliated, you know. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was getting a vicarious rush off of it. That was real satisfying to me, to see him reduced to that.
So when you were in prison, and I guess for about 40 years, starting at the age of around 23, did you ever imagine the day when you would get out of prison, or did you assume that you would spend the rest of your life in prison?
Well, I dreamed about getting out of prison. I had hopes of getting out of prison. I filed probably no less than 8 or 9 writs of habeas corpus trying to force the courts to let me out of prison. But I had finally more or less given up until I met Joan. And after we developed a relationship, she made me want to get back out, you know, so that I could have a life with her. So I got back into the legal work, but I knew I couldn't get out by a technicality concerning my own case. That was all water under the bridge. So I asked myself, what could I do to put enough strain on the prison system to make them decide that it would be more worth their while to let me go than to me finish this case. So I filed a 1983 civil action suit alleging failure to protect. They had admitted in the newspaper that they were 3,000 officers short. And my contention was that you could not protect inmates from one another or staff from inmates with that great of a shortage. Well, I came up for parole. I had just been denied in the federal district court in Texas. I came up for parole and I was given a 3-year set-off. I put in for special review and they automatically denied me. But then my case, my civil suit transferred from the district court into the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has a reputation of being much more lenient and going by the book than the district courts. So I can't prove this, but my belief is that someone in the Texas Attorney General's office whispered into the ear of somebody in the TDC legal department's ear and said, look, it may be 1,000,000 to 1 odds against this guy getting relief. But if he does, it's going to cost TDCJ in the state of Texas a trainload of money, because you're either going to have to hire 3,000 officers quickly or release enough inmates to bring the ratio of guards and inmates into harmony, you know. So after just getting a 3-year set-off, within 3 weeks of being transferred to the Fifth Circuit, they brought me back up for parole, gave me an FI-1, which means, you know, ticket out the door. And within a couple of months, I walked out the front door. Of course, I wasn't totally free. I had to go back to Kentucky and settle up an escape charge.
So to the extent that you had imagined that day getting out of prison, when you finally did, was it as you had imagined or different somehow?
Well, it was and it wasn't. You know, the free world had changed fairly dramatically in 40 years. And I was I wasn't expecting toilets that automatically flush when you stand up. And I wasn't familiar with sinks that had motion detectors in them, you know. And I had my first real intellectual challenge was at a self-serve gas station when I had to fill up the car. It was kind of traumatic. I had to stand there and ask myself, do I want to continue this frustration, or do I humble myself and go ask somebody for help, you know? But on a more serious side, you know, when I met Joan in prison, I would go to the visitation room and put on my very best airs, you know, because she was an ex-school teacher, and her first husband was a professor of English at SMU in Dallas. And that set a very high standard that I had to meet, you know. And I still garble my English, as you probably already recognize. But in the context of the visiting room, you can hold it up, you know. You can be good for a couple of hours, you know, and hold down the profanity and all that. But when I got home, more and more of these grammatical errors started popping up, and more sailor language would pop up, you know, and she's very quick to chastise me. But in other areas, you know, we were in prison. When we first met in 1999, I can't remember our exact ages, but we were both much younger when I got out. And we had this idealistic vision of being romantically involved, having a healthy, virile sexual relationship. But when I actually came home and we got together, you know, in the very beginning, even before we became romantically committed, she kept saying she was adopting me, you know, and she's 16 years older than I am. So somewhere along the way, she transitioned from being my romantic partner to my mother. And I had sort of an Oedipus complex. I wasn't comfortable making love to my mother. And that's caused a great deal of stress and strain, you know. But because we care so much about one another, we're dealing with it, you know. We've been to a counselor, you know, getting advice and stuff. And what we're trying to do now is settle into a devoted friendship, you know. And I have to give her a great deal of credit. She has put up with a lot of bullshit, to put it lightly. You know, when I get stressed out, when things are not going as I expect them to go, I have a tendency to follow my father's example and give in to the gene that we're supposed to inherit. And I drank too much sometimes, you know, and that's caused problems. But I'm dealing with that, you know. I have it pretty much under control. I haven't fallen down in months.
In terms of Joan's circle of friends and family, and your family and friends and people that you knew from prison, are there challenges with that in terms of you know, her wider circle of friends and family, and you guys being together?
Well, yeah. You know, as we developed our relationship and we got to know one another, little tidbits of information started popping up, like her father-in-law was John Steinbeck's senior editor, and they were best buddies, and she was family friends with Arthur Miller and people like that, you know, of stature. And I came from the way on the other side of the tracks, and I never dreamed that I would be socializing with that type of group of people. And every time I meet some of her family friends or her family, I'm under this big strain. You know, I have to live up to this standard. And I think I've fared fairly well. I haven't let her down too terribly bad, or I'm still living in the house. But to give you an example, when I was still in prison and she started making the announcements to her daughter and her son and her daughter-in-law that she was becoming seriously involved with a ex-death row inmate, well, they were a little bit concerned about it. And they sent Ellen, the ex-daughter-in-law, as an emissary to feel me out. And Joan got a special visit arranged for that. And I went out there and we had a grand visit, you know, everything went fine. But then a year or so later, Anna wasn't gonna, her daughter wasn't gonna totally depend on Ellen's opinion. So she came herself, and I wear dentures, you know. And on Saturday night before the Sunday's visit, I put my dentures in a cup with 2 tablets of Efferdent to really polish them up. I wanted to go out there with a Hollywood smile. And the next morning when I woke up and I reached for my cup, it wasn't there. My teeth weren't there. So then I felt like, well, I forgot them on the sink. So I went to the latrine and looked around. My teeth are nowhere to be found. I'm running around, wound up offering 5 bag of coffee reward for my teeth, you know. But they never showed up, and the time ticked away, and I had to go to the visiting room, smooth mouth. And but I went out there and cracked some kind of joke about it, and Anna took it in stride, and of course she psychoanalyzed me for 2 hours, but she went away feeling like her mother knew what she was doing, you know.
So I think we're at the point where we can throw it open to the floor here if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask.
Can you talk a little bit about the organization that you formed, and what kind of progress you think it's making, or what you still hope to accomplish?
When I was in prison, I had heard about Texas Cure. It was founded in 1972 by a guy named Charles Sullivan and his wife Pauline. Charlie had been a Catholic priest and Pauline had been a nun. But they became romantically involved and dropped out of the church so that they could get married. But they were truly altruistic in nature, and they wanted to do something for the community. So they had learned of these wives and mothers who had sons and husbands in prison, but no transportation to go visit them. So they began to raise funds and charter buses, and they would take these people from San Antonio to the various prison units. And there were only 12 back then. There's 111 now. But and in the course of those trips, they started hearing all these horror stories about how cruelly the inmates were treated by the guards and the building tenders. Building tenders were convict guards. They were inmates, but they were given special power over other inmates, enforcers. Well, then they started lobbying with the Texas legislature for criminal reform, prison reform. And I was interested in them, but to be honest, I thought that they were too passive, that they weren't aggressive enough. You know, I was, like Joan tells me often, I look for immediate gratification, you know. And when you're out in the cotton fields picking cotton, being driven like a Hebrew slave, you want relief right here, right now. So my answer was to bring about work strikes. In 1978, the day after the Ruiz litigation began, which was the biggest prison reform litigation in U.S. history, it cost, at this time, I would say it has cost Texas close to $3 billion because it turned the prison inside out and upside down. They had to totally reconstruct it to make, you know, it was terribly overcrowded. They had 5 men living in 2 men's cells and things like that. But anyway, the day after the suit began, I was able to kick off a work strike that eventually shut down the whole system for 2 weeks. And they charged me with mutiny, inciting a mutiny. You know, I thought that was something that happened on big boats. But anyway, because of that mutiny, I was placed on pre-hearing detention. And usually when convicts in Texas rebelled back in those days, you were run through a gauntlet of axe handles, you know, and beaten senseless. Well, Charlie Sullivan knew that. And he wanted to try to make a showing to the prison administrators to let them know that someone was out there watching them, monitoring them, and try to prevent that from happening. And a guard that was one of the better guards brought me a newspaper article out of the Houston Post before it went belly up. And it told about Charlie tried to get inside the unit to monitor, but the officials wouldn't let him in. So he would just cruise up and down in front of the front gate to the prison unit. And that made me respect the organization, you know. So I started corresponding with Charlie on and off for years. And when I got out, my wife Joan had become involved with Texas Cure. So I became a member, and then I became a board member, and ultimately I was nominated president. So what we do is we mediate for inmates who are having difficulties with the administration, whether it's not getting enough medical attention, having trust fund disputes over their money, or being charged with a bogus disciplinary case. And we go to all of the TDC public meetings. You know, they have a couple of forums like the Ombudsman's meeting and the PAC meeting. I don't know what PAC stands for, but it's an acronym. But anyway, we've gotten to know several administrators on a one-to-one basis, and we get things done. You know, we don't make sweeping changes, but it's like I told a friend of ours who's a civil rights leader not long ago. We don't move mountains, but we kick the shit out of molehills.
How are we doing on time? Is there any, I think we have time for one more question, yeah.
Thank you for your story. I had a question, if you could speak a little bit, not to be depressing at all, about the mentally ill that are in institutions and prisons, correctional facilities, the lack of care and treatment surrounding people who are mentally ill, and also a little bit about, if you can, if you know about it, about punitive segregation and solitary confinement and what that does to someone.
Yeah, well, I spent quite a bit of time on ADSEG myself. For the mutiny, I did 2.5 years for that, and I attempted to escape, and I did 3 years for that on SEG. As I'm sure you know, you're locked down 23 hours a day, roughly. And the mentally ill individuals who enter prison, they create disturbances. They don't follow orders like the average person does. You know, they don't understand. They don't comprehend what's going on. And officers won't take the time. They're not trained. They don't have the experience of how to deal with these individuals. So the vast majority of them migrate into ADSEG. And whatever mental issues they take in there are help me out. Yeah. They're just made worse, you know.
I'd say solitary confinement.
Well, ADSEG, it's a form of solitary confinement. The only difference between solitary confinement and ADSEG is you have your personal property. Not all of it, but a certain amount of it. But you're still locked down 23 hours a day, 24/7. And the mentally ill, they have a very hard road to hoe, not only with the administration, but with other inmates. You know, other inmates will take advantage of them in various, in summary ways. You know, sexually, extortion, whatever. It's not an enviable position to be in. And then I forgot the second part of the question.
No, I think and how solitary confinement is damaging to people.
Oh yeah, solitary definitely harms your mind. You know, every time that I came out of ADSEG, it would take me 18 months to start functioning like I should in population. You know, you're totally you live in a 5x9 cell, 23 hours a day, and your consciousness constricts to that kind of containment, you know, so that when you're it's a form of sensory deprivation, and then all of a sudden they flip the floodgates and then all the sensory perceptions rush in, you know, and you're disoriented, and you don't do well in crowds. You're used to being alone in a cell, and then all of a sudden you're pushed into a day room with 150, 200 people trying to out-talk one another, you know. It's very disorienting.
Okay, I think that does it.
All right.